Well, hello, hello, hello. Happy Friday, everybody. It's so great to see our usual friends here, our loyal followers. We so appreciate you and some new faces. I wanted to start by welcoming everybody. And my name is Suman Kapoor. I'm CEO of Well Balanced Solutions. I'm a coach and consultant, and I'm here with Tiffany Castano, CEO of Sefer LLC, and she's an HR consultant. And we are so excited to have our amazing guest speaker here today. But before I do that, I wanted to just hit on some of our housekeeping rules. As we all know, this is being recorded, so please be careful on what you share. Think about it before you share some information you may not want to share, but of course, this is always a safe space. We have these conversations every Friday at 12 p.m. We'll post out our replay links so you can join our YouTube channel. Tiffany, is there anything else? I feel like I'm missing something. Am I missing anything?
We're at January 22nd, so next week will be our unrecorded session. So we're so grateful to have Shary here, and Suman's going to kick us off with that in a bit with her intro. And yeah, we're just grateful you're here. So feel free to, if you don't want your cameras on, I see some of you don't have them on, that's totally cool. Again, safe space. So we're grateful that you're here. And for our team replay folks, we'll see you on the other side.
Yes, and use that chat section. That's always a great way. I know our audience here loves using that. So we will monitor the chat, and I'd love to go ahead and introduce Shary. So Shary Tran is a first-generation Vietnamese American born in Wisconsin to refugee parents who escaped the Vietnam War. Sparked by her experience of a multicultural upbringing, Shary has dedicated the last 25 years to personal and professional career advancing diversity and inclusion. She is a principal diversity, equity, and inclusion business partner at Amazon, and is a co-founder of Elevation, a network dedicated to elevating the visibility and success of the Asian community in Southeast Wisconsin, and a founding member of the Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Coalition of Wisconsin, and advocating collective of Asian serving organizations in Wisconsin. Welcome, Shary. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm glad to be here.
I love your background, and I'm sure there's so many other accolades that we are not sharing here today. You're extremely accomplished. So even more thank yous for being with us today. I know your days are super busy, but we appreciate you being here today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And of course, we won't get into accolades because I'm also Midwestern and we don't like to toot our horn. So we don't talk about those kinds of things, right?
Yep, but we always should learn how to do it. It's always a good thing.
Very true. Very true.
We work so hard at all the stuff that we can accomplish that we should sometimes toot our own horn. So I'd love to start by, asking a little bit. I was very fascinated by your little snippet there about your upbringing. Can you share a little bit about what it was like growing up, coming to America as a youngster, and sort of growing up here and having to manage the two cultures? So similar to you, I'm first generation here, Asian immigrant parents, and I still say I have an identity crisis, even in my adult age. So I'd love if you can share just a little bit about sort of that background and how you got into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. As a family of immigrants, I was the only one in my family that was born here in the U.S. My family, came over, like I said, like you mentioned, at the end of the war, and experience in refugee camps, and really kind of being welcomed by a community of people that you've never met before is a unique experience. It really shapes you, right? And it's very different. I truly appreciate the timing in which my family came to the United States, because of course the refugee experience today is very different. So at that time, it was very much, a lot of sponsorships from, Lutheran services organizations, churches around the country sponsoring, Vietnamese families at that time. And we were fortunate enough to be sponsored by a church in Wisconsin. That's how I ended up here. The real benefit to, well, there were challenges and benefits, I guess, of growing up in a community where we were the only ones that looked like us. It was a very suburban white community where I grew up. And it was always a struggle because once you stepped into past the threshold of my family's household, it was a very different world than when I stepped outside. Going to school, I kind of learned English by watching television at home. My mother didn't speak English. You know, it was kind of one of those things I kind of was self-taught in that regard. And being able to navigate two cultures at the same time and really trying to identify where I fit has been a constant, you know, kind of, like you said, identity kind of struggle that a lot of, you know, first generation, you know, multicultural children deal with. And, you know, not being Asian enough for, you know, the Asian community and not, you know, white enough or, you know, American enough, so to speak, for the community where I went to school was a constant questioning, like, well, where do I fit? You know, what is it that I have to do to be accepted? And it really created in me this sense of constantly trying to bridge the gap between those two things. It took a long time for me to build trust with people and build friendships to the point where I would welcome people into my world at home, right? And that experience was kind of stressful at first. I wasn't sure how they would kind of experience like taking your shoes off when you got into my house and like the smells and the sounds and the things they would hear. But friends really were energized by it. They thought it was really interesting. They found it really neat and very cool. I was like, wow, this is not what I expected. And I kind of felt energy from that. Sharing my culture with them was something that I really got excited about. And I wanted to do more of that. And then that sparked me to also want to learn more about other cultures as well, you know, and that kind of sparked that whole, you know, cross-cultural awareness and learning bug within me. So as I continued to grow in school, college, diversity was something that was kind of a passion for me that sparked from that experience. I loved teaching people about different cultures. I loved learning about different cultures. And I was so thankful that ultimately I was able to find a career that paid me to do those things, right? So being a diversity practitioner was around educating people about different cultures and the values and the benefits around having a holistic cultural experience outside of your own, and really applying that to how that helps us, you know, perform better in the workplace, how to really understand that culture is not just a nationality thing or a race thing. There's so many different aspects to diversity that all lend themselves to how we show up and how we work together in the workplace. So there were great opportunities to take my personal experience growing up and apply that to lessons learned that we can apply to the workplace. So that's kind of how I ended up working in diversity and inclusion. I started my career in D&I right out of college. My first internship was in an HR type of role. And I always joke that people don't really go into HR on purpose. They just kind of end up there somehow. I don't know if that's really, you know, something that I knew existed. I thought I was just hiring and firing people, but there was so much more to it, right? And diversity touches all of those pieces. So I was really able to, you know, hone my skills around, you know, what it meant to really create an experience for people in the workplace and how so many people have such different experiences and how to account for all of that to make sure everyone feels included and everyone feels engaged. So those are really values that have carried me through my diversity career, really focusing on the employee experience, employee engagement, development, education, and growth, you know, all of those things that are unique to each individual in the workplace.
I love it. I love it. And, you know, me being in HR, see some HR folks down here in the audience too. I'm really excited, but love what I do. And I love how you describe that it's cultural, right? Like but not just culture as to what it makes us up of ourselves, but like really what is the organization's culture? And people don't often see those things that way. And they don't often understand that, you know, there's a lot of tokenism that goes on, like, oh, if we do X or bring X person in, then we solve the world's problems or our organization's problems. And that's not the right way to do it. So I'm so glad that you're starting to share these nuggets with us. And I'm excited to hear more. So I know we're going to talk about, you kind of did a lead in for us on performance reviews. I know for me, that's something that I work on a lot with organizations. So I'm here and ready to learn more. And do you know, kind of just want to kick us off with sharing that, and we'll go from there. We'll monitor the chat. Feel free to monitor the chat.
Talking about performance, it's such a subjective thing a lot of times. And when we think about things that are subjective, we tend to understand how bias creeps into those things a lot. I've been spending the last, I'd say 7 years or so, focusing and learning a lot more about unconscious bias and how it applies to the workplace. Before joining Amazon, I was in healthcare for 8 years, and, really took a lot of that time helping to educate and train our care providers around unconscious bias and how it impacts patient experience. And a lot of those same lessons learned can apply elsewhere. But understanding that bias creeps into everything that we do all the time is one of those things we have to really understand and really accept, that it's everywhere. It impacts everything. Every decision that we make is, impacted by some biases, whether we want them to or not. That's why we call them unconscious, right? So when we talk about things where it becomes super important is when these decisions that we make impact other people's lives, right? And how we have to be very cognizant of how bias can impact those things. So when we're talking about performance evaluations, right? These are decisions that could just really change the trajectory of someone's career, someone's earnings potential, all of those things. It can really have a really huge impact there. So really understanding what are some of those pitfalls, what are some of those barriers that bias can create there. And in general, when we talk about performance reviews, we have, biases that you probably may be aware of, like, for example, the most common one I think all of us kind of get subjected to is that recency bias, which is that, like, what have you done for me lately bias, right? We think about the last thing that we saw somebody do, or the last month. We have a 12-month performance cycle, but we only think about what happened in the last month because that's what we just remembered. And that really paints with a broad brush the entire employee's performance for the year. So things that we kind of put in place to mitigate that is trying to establish, monthly check-ins where we can track and document performance throughout the year. Whether it be 30, 60, 90-day kind of check-ins, where we can make sure that we're looking at the whole of that person's experience during that time. So really, and I'll talk a little bit more about just the general biases, then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about how we need to tweak that a little bit in a COVID environment as well, which is super important for us right now. But back to the general biases that impact performance reviews, we also have visibility bias, right? Like, what you see, it's like out of sight, out of mind kind of a bias, right? So, there's been long-standing studies around generational diversity and how face time is so important for, like, baby boomers and, folks that have been in the workplace a long time and they really appreciate face time, and how younger generations really like, if I get my work done, who cares if you see me or not, right? And we may be biased in what we think is dedication, what is hard work. If I see you first in the office and last to leave, that means you're a hard worker, right? That's a bias based on our own perceptions, based on maybe our own experiences. So we have to be very aware of making sure that we are really reframing, is this really what's important to get the work done? Is this really impacting performance? Do I have to see them? Or is it, am I looking at, the work product? That's what really have to focus on as well. We also look at flexibility as a bias, right? If somebody's willing to call in, like, at the last minute to handle a situation, we're going to give them extra bonus points for being a team player, right? And really stepping up. But not everybody has the capability to have that flexibility, whether it is, if you have young children at home, or if you have, a different schedule that doesn't allow you to be super flexible. I tend to benefit from, the fact that I don't have children, and I am single, and I can take the extra time to do things, and I can volunteer to take on this extra work, but that's not everybody's case, right? So that flexibility bias can tie into there as well. So let's try not to award bonus points for people because of their flexibility, because that's a very subjective thing as well. And then ultimately we talk about gender biases, right? And that's going to lead us into our final topic. But gender biases always show up in performance reviews, especially in the words that people use to describe performance when it comes to gender, right? We tend to see a lot of women get performance feedback based on, like, personality traits, or, they're really great, easy to work with, or, they're very agreeable, or they're nice, or, things that are more personality related. But when we talk about men, it's very technical skill, focused kind of performance feedback that they're getting, like, you really, created that project was done, like, early, and, like, very measurable things, where we tend to really we have to focus more on task-related performance outputs versus, traits and characteristics about a person's personality. Those are some of those general biases we always come up against, right, in a performance evaluation environment. And then one of the things that I learned more recently was something called idiosyncratic rater bias, which is, if somebody's really good at something that you're not good at, you're going to think they're amazing, right? At that, you're going to rate them really high. But if I'm really good at something and you can't do it, I was like, well, you're just not really performing well then, right? Because I can do it really easily. How come you can't? So really, we need to step back and take ourselves out of that comparative equation, right? And start to think about things. Maybe if we have a problem kind of looking outside of our own lens, maybe we start to reframe the questions we ask from our own perspective. Instead of saying, does this person do this well compared to me? Ask questions like, would I hire this person again if I had the opportunity? So, if that makes it a little bit easier for you to see things from a perspective of from self first, that could be a way to calibrate things differently. But going back to the real nuts and bolts and why I really wanted to have this conversation with this group is because we find ourselves, of course, in such a different situation than we're used to today with the COVID pandemic, right? And it adds a whole nother layer of complexity to performance evaluation because things like recency, visibility are so impacted, right? We're working remotely. A lot of people are working remotely. So that's creating a whole nother level of ambiguity, which is a key driver and a key, it's like a ripe environment for bias when there's ambiguity present, right? Because if we don't have all the answers, we start filling in the blanks with what we know. And if we only fill in the blanks with what we know, it's really going to be painted from our own lens, right? So we're really not able to really get a full holistic picture with all this ambiguity happening. People are working from home, so that's limited visibility that we're getting, right? Taking that and exponentially growing that piece of it. And then the recency bias piece, right? Are we looking at performance that people had in the first quarter of the year where we were still in the workplace? Do we remember that? Do we remember what happened January to March, or is like all a blur right now, right? So really having to really think back on that piece of it. But one thing that's critical about why thinking about performance reviews and performance evaluations during COVID is so critical is because it's severely disproportionately impacting women and people of color. The COVID pandemic, right? On multiple fronts, not just from a medical perspective, but also from the perspective of folks that are impacted by the change in work and the change in industries in general. So this pandemic's created universal challenges for everyone, but we're seeing that it's a disproportionate burden for women and people of color because of things like the industries that are impacted, essential workers that tend to be more diverse population, essential workers being highly impacted there, women being highly impacted because the childcare industry was severely impacted as well as thinking about schools being closed. All of these impacts have like this trickle down effect, which cascades and really kind of impacts women and parents most severely during this time. So much so that we've seen 865,000 American women drop out of the workforce in September after the COVID, thing started to really explode. And not a lot of those women have returned. Some have returned to the workplace or were in different ways, but just thinking about the impact that has when we talked about why performance reviews are so important. Women are finding themselves needing to lean out more than lean in right now because of these additional burdens around childcare, around those different responsibilities. And when you think about the impact, let me just monetize this, that one study found that women who took just 1 year out of the workforce had annual earnings that were 39% lower than women who did not. So just 1 year can impact your earnings potential over time. So thinking about all the women that are doing that now and taking this time, either time away, leaving the workforce, or even just, taking a break, how is that impacting, their career growth? It's really stepping back all the progress that we've made around gender equity and pay over the last 25 years in a matter of 1 year. that's really, rolled back the progress. So we have to really be cognizant of that. One of the things, there's a study that was a collaboration between the Century Foundation and the Center for American Progress that has really phenomenal insights and research. And I can share that, Tiffany, with you, the link to that report, so you can share that with this group. But it talks more about how even, just the fact that the risk of mothers leaving the workforce, and there were about 9.7 million working mothers in 2019 with children under the age of 6, right? So that's the impacted population that we're talking about because of COVID, right? So these 9.7 million working mothers had to find alternatives or had to adjust or had to shift, their work styles in order to meet the demands of their jobs while still maintaining this household balance with children going to school at home or not having childcare options available to them because, daycares had closed. So assuming that all of those mothers maybe took some time out of the workplace to assume those additional caretaking responsibilities, that amounts to about $64.5 billion of lost earnings, right, during that time. It's phenomenal, the impact on the economy that has. And then when we double on top of that, of course, there's the buzzword around intersectionality, right? So women, but also Black, Latino, Indigenous women especially, are feeling multiple effects of this because not only are they losing jobs, losing health, childcare, all of this, or even being forced to, if they're assuming essential worker roles, having to still find a way to go to work and not having anybody to help care for their children. And as a result of that, it's creating, additional burdens for them, not just work burdens, but mental health issues, concerns around stress and anxiety. Think about how people had to just change the way they did things just from a day-to-day practice. How us, for me, I use myself as an example, no children, and don't have to worry about those things. And it's still stressful for me to work in this work from home environment and change my patterns and change my habits to make sure I'm doing the work that needs to be done. I couldn't imagine, I have friends who share their stories, who have young children at home, how much harder it is for them. And it's really a huge consideration. We think about how do we value performance in this kind of environment? How do we adjust and recalibrate what good performance looks like right now? Are we doing that? Are we cognizant of, should I really be thinking about things differently? Should I be asking different questions? Should I be evaluating different things? Not the normal things that I evaluated last year. Should I be thinking more about, more about behaviors versus goals? More about longer term potential versus current performance. Are there ways that I can shift that discussion in a different way? So here are some of the things, some of the tips that I would share to help us be cognizant of this new environment when we're thinking about performance. Being aware of biases still, but just being aware how much more heightened they are in this environment, to be extra cognizant of them. And then second, looking at your performance review process right now. Just kind of taking a step back and looking at it and seeing if it's going to serve the same, purpose for you as it did previously. It's not really enough for company policies to be clear about evaluation criteria. It needs to be consistent criteria, and it needs to be very shared. There has to be shared understanding of what that criteria is. If you're going to be adjusting that during this time, does everybody know what, does everyone agree on what top tier performance looks like? Are there descriptions and examples of that you can really use during this time to really gauge whether somebody is meeting that bar or not? There has to be alignment amongst all those decision makers that are making those performance, decisions, that they all agree that this is what, good looks like, this is what great looks like, this is what exceptional looks like. Also to engage others in the discussion. If you're having, review discussions as a group, do you have somebody who can be that, I guess, the monitor of that conversation, always interject and say, well, what about this? Was this driven by, were they affected by, COVID, related, issues? Or is this something that could be, why did you make that assessment? What criteria did you use to make that decision? Just kind of a double check kind of a check and balance when people are making decisions about people's performance. And also another great way to kind of balance out so we don't have one general perspective is having a lot of peer feedback for your employees as well. You know, giving them the opportunity to solicit feedback from other folks that they've worked with to provide a more holistic perspective of what they've been doing and what their work has been. So that's looking at the process, right? So looked at our own biases, we look at the process, but also then calibrating perceptions of performance is that last piece of it, right? So there are alternative ways to evaluate performance that doesn't compromise your high standards, right? That's a big deal for people. Like they don't want to give people a pass. You know, we still think performance is important, but we just need to look at it a little bit differently, right? Not make it easier, not, you know, lower the bar, so to speak, but how do we just, you know, maybe the bar looks a little different. So focusing on behaviors more than goals, thinking long-term versus, you know, just what their performance was most recently. You might want to prorate goals, you know, to compensate for maybe leaves of absence that people have had to take. You know, maybe other goals that could be impacting, for example, you know, evaluating their flexibility or their adaptability in a different way. Not saying, you know, were they flexible, but did they manage things in a different way? Maybe even asking them, you know, did they get more creative or innovative during this time? You know, that's a criteria we all want to see in our workplaces is creativity and innovation. Did they communicate challenges in a timely manner? You know, so was their communication up during this time so they can keep you aware of what is challenging for them? Some other questions you might want to ask. Let's see. You know, what challenge are you most proud of overcoming during this time? Is a good question for a performance evaluation as well. It gives people an opportunity to share with them what's important, what they worked on, what they're proud of, as far as the challenge that they've overcome. But one thing that also is important as far as calibrating the perception of performance is to really think about, you know, what you're still thinking about outputs, right? You know, did they get, you know, did they accomplish a goal? Did they achieve something that helped the team during this time? You know, were there things that they did to help put, you know, COVID protocols in place? Did they take on additional roles that were different? When I think about in my healthcare role previously, we had people that were redeployed into different areas and did different things, you know? So maybe it wasn't their normal goals. They weren't accomplishing their specific goals that were related to their job, but they did other things that were, you know, helping the organization overall. So a more broad perspective of supporting the team and in a different way. The final thing that I would say to think about when evaluating employees during COVID is to really empathize, right? To understand the employee situation. So before even going into writing up your performance reviews, are you asking the employee, you know, what's going on for them? Like, how are you coping? What support do you need? What new responsibilities are you taking on? What adjustments have you made? You know, what strengths are you seeing that are super useful to you right now during this time that are, you know, you're flexing more than you were before? Or, you know, what are some suggestions that you might have to help us, you know, how you can work more effectively or efficiently right now? Giving them that opportunity to provide that feedback. It gives leaders like a more bird's eye view of what the environment is for each employee, and maybe some things might come out during that conversation that you weren't aware of that can help you recalibrate a little bit more. You can see maybe if they need different accommodations to maybe get their work done in a different way. If you didn't realize, oh, I'm having really bad Wi-Fi issues and it's taking a longer time for me to get things done. If we didn't know about that, we might be docking them for taking longer to complete a task when, you know, we could really remedy that situation and really, you know, if we really were aware of some of those challenges that we weren't being made privy to. One thing I will caution about from, I guess, the HR perspective, the HR compliance hat, right? Be careful if you don't get too personal questions as far as what you're asking about what's happening at home, because it's just important to make sure that you want to get a sense of challenges, but don't get too specific about family, medical issues, things like that, you know, just to avoid any other, you know, violations of employment regulations and laws like that. But, you know, of course, if you have questions, if you are unsure, ask your legal counsel for advice on what you want to ask. But just wanted to put that out there as a caveat as well. So, when I think about situations where people are working remotely, I think a lot of it's hard to manage in a remote environment, right? It's hard to really prepare ourselves for this new way of thinking about work. So what things that have worked well for me is establishing, check-ins with my team members on a regular basis, and not always just going straight into like the work that needs to be done, taking the time to say, how you doing? What's going on? What's new? What do you want me to, is there something you want me to know, right now? Like, is there anything that I should know? To give people that opportunity to share something that's on their mind, and being able to address that to start off with. Because really right now, people are so concerned about, the challenges right now. Your employees may not be saying it, but they're wondering, are they taking into account all this other stuff that's going on in my life right now when I'm getting evaluated? Are they thinking about that? And it's important to reassure our staff members that yes, we are, and this is what I'm doing to make sure that it's, a very fair and equitable process, and that I'm taking into account all these circumstances. So that was an important thing for me with my team. We sent out messages to everyone, letting them know we see you, we hear you, we understand these are challenges, and this is what we're going to do to make sure that that doesn't impact our performance process this year. So it's really important to kind of let people know that you are taking that into account. So those are just some of the key things I would share from this initial overview, that being very cognizant of how bias creeps in even more so right now, to really recalibrate what we think good performance looks like and what that means, and really making sure that we're not letting our experience and what we see, what we hear, which is very limited right now, become the only thing that we use to gauge performance during this time. So those are just some key thoughts. So I would love to answer questions that you have at this point, or if we want to dig deeper into some of that research, I'd love to do that too.
Yeah, so I've actually jotted a couple of questions, and I know that there's some things here in the thread where basically, everyone is absolutely agreeing, that empathy is such an important thing. There's talk about, there's some really good stats that Shannon put in here also, that goes on with some of the things that you talked about, women losing the jobs and so on and so forth. But there were two questions that I had when you talked about thinking about understanding what's happening in the home. And I'm curious specifically with single employees versus those who have to manage families. How do you stay away or find that balance to say, okay, they have kids, so, and I'm not using the right terminology, so excuse me for that, but they have kids. Am I going to be more lenient in when I review their performance versus, oh, they're single, they have nothing, nothing else in the house. Yes, they might be dealing with some challenges, social issues, but how do I make sure that I'm sort of equating the two very polar opposite situations?
Mm-hmm. So that's another tendency we have, is to try to compare like one person to another person, where we really should just be comparing them to a bar, not to another individual, but this performance criteria. Really, let's stick to that as what we're comparing people to. So we're not, bringing in these extra variables that aren't the same, right, for people. So, let's say, for example, Tiffany has a child and I don't, but we have very different levels of engagement. Instead of saying, how is Shary compared to Tiffany, say, how is Shary compared to our, level 1, level 2, level 3 performance that we've established firm criteria on, right? So it really becomes more, how do you measure against the bar, not how do you measure against person A, B, or C? That would be my advice there, to make it, that makes it more equitable.
Yeah, and then I think it's taking that information and making sure that the employees, it's part of the culture, that the employees understand that this is what's happening, right? Because again, I'm old school, and in my mind, this shift makes total sense, but experience-wise, it's not what I've experienced. Right? I've had jobs where I was single, so it was okay to ask me to stay late, and it was okay to come in on weekends. That was the culture, I guess, of the environment that I was in. And so I think all of this has to be built into the culture, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, and I would caution against that too. People make these assumptions about what it means to be a single person, and that you don't have any other responsibilities. Is that that's a stereotype, right? And that's something we need to be very careful of. That stereotypes creep in to these decision-making processes too, based on what we experience, what we know, or what we think. And maybe you have a very maybe you're caring for a parent, and that's a responsibility that people don't necessarily share. That could be impacting your ability to be flexible. So just assuming, again, what assumptions we make about parents, that we're making similar or, opposed assumptions about people who don't have children as well. So being very cognizant of that.
That's so important too. And just I've seen so much over the years when I'm dealing with employee relations issues where people are like, well, this isn't fair. There's always this perception of fairness, right? And people don't understand the difference that like fair is not always equal, and there should be some accommodations, and there might have to be, and we can't always tell you what that is, but you have to lead with kind of that empathy that you talked about and understand that we should be checking in regularly. We should have a strong onboarding plan. We should be asking like, are you okay? Or how can I support you? Because that's how we know what's going on with our employees, and we know how we can adjust for that within the process. Was there anything else in the chat that I missed, Suman?
I want to share something in the chat. Actually, it's an image that you might have seen it, you might not have, but if I can paste it here, I will. Is that not going to work? I'll have to save it as a file. But it talks about the difference between equity and equality, right? You might have seen the image before or not. Let me just try to save it really quickly here instead. And then I'll paste it in here. But what each person needs to be successful is not the same, right? We should be looking at the outcomes of their performance, not what it takes for them to get there necessarily. So if I can attach the file here once again. And I love this image because it really, demonstrates it. If you can open that up, it shows like different people using different bicycles and how everyone needs a different bicycle to be able to get to point A to point B, right? And it's not going to be the same for everyone, whether somebody needs a recumbent bike, if somebody needs a taller bike or a shorter bike, it's different bikes are needed to get to get somebody to be successful. So we have to really keep that in mind, that it's not one size fits all. So when we think about things differently from that perspective, when it comes to folks that are dealing with the pandemic, that's important as well. And I want to make sure that it's not just the work from home perception that people are keeping in mind during this time. It's people that are also having to work during COVID as well in the workplace, and the additional stresses and anxiety and fears that they're dealing with as well, and how that could impact performance also. We've got to really think about our frontline employees that we may have in our workplaces and how this may be impacting them, because they're going to have to, they've been employing like whole new COVID pandemic types of protocols that are above and beyond what they're normally doing. So how is that, impacting their productivity and their skill sets? And I think about, all of the safety precautions you have to take in a healthcare environment. And, now you have to do X, Y, and Z, and you can only work, in spaces like this, certain times of the day. And how does that limit, your ability to just, do your best work sometimes? So everything, needs to be a little bit different as an approach, and equity isn't one size fits all. So I love to have that image and share that with folks. It gives a good mental model as well, that it's people need different supports to be successful.
Love that. I love that you pointed that out. I'm always telling people this. I keep trying to get them to understand. So there's a question here in the chat. How have you seen employees advocate for themselves and their situation respectfully?
Mm-hmm. How to advocate for themselves respectfully. That's an interesting question. When I've heard, the reason why sometimes in the workplace you just hear comments bubbling up, well, maybe it be through an employee resource group or a affinity group in your workplace. You might be hearing some of these things bubble up, and you just might hear people question things like, what is the organization doing about, women or moms or, parents that are dealing with additional stresses? And that kind of continues to kind of get forwarded to the next person, the next person, the next person, right? And then it somehow gets to HR or gets to, leadership, and then, something has to happen. I think people can advocate for themselves in a way by highlighting what, they're doing differently now that they think has been helpful for them. Talking about, these have been the challenges that I've overcome in order to, meet the bar of performance. I think, I'm not really sure how to state this from like a respectful way, because I haven't heard anybody kind of advocate for themselves disrespectfully, I guess, trying to equate that. But it's really, saying this is, you have to be very vocal about what you're doing right now to your leader, and sharing, if there are challenges, being honest about those challenges, being clear about those challenges, and then working with your leader to either, find ways to accommodate those challenges, advocating for flexibility in not just, times that you get things done. I've been finding ourselves working a lot longer hours, a lot longer days, or shifting when we work because of different responsibilities. So a lot of times some folks in our workplace will put a note on their emails like, I'm sending this email to you at a time that's convenient for me, not expecting you to respond right now, but when it's convenient for you, based on your alternate, work environment right now, please respond when you can. I think that's been very helpful by letting people just, be able to respond in their own time, giving people that flexibility, or giving people, expected timeframes when you might need information back, so they don't feel it's immediate. Like, I need to work on this by this time. If you can, if you find time between now and then to get this to me, that gives people a lot more structure, because gosh, people are just thriving for more structure right now, right? Because it's just so all over the place right now. We can at least give people a little bit of that to hold on to. I think that's helpful as well.
Love it. I love it. These are some helpful tips. And it looks like Shannon, it looks like there's some stuff dropped in the chat too. Oh, I love it. It's a giving tree on equity and tools to address identity and inequality. And then justice, fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunity. So thank you for sharing that. I'm just scrolling to see these comments they come in so fast and fierce sometimes. No, I think that I see there's a comment. I love performance criteria based on a metric, not against each other. And we see that on the hiring side, and as people move through the employee life cycle too, where we create jobs that are designed for people, for the person, versus what the business needs, and that can disparately impact people as well. So do you have any tips, Shary, on, I think you gave us a lot of them, but anything else you'd share around what a good metric looks like, or how to maybe make sure that they're more objective versus that comparison?
Yeah, I mean, if you're able to give people a very clear description of what, each performance level looks like, there may be questions like, does this person, communicate, challenges, immediately, or do they, let me pull something up really quick. Let me just switch gears for a second as I look for some examples of that to respond to that. But I think if you have questions that you can ask about, just did they deliver on project successfully? Are you making sure you're evaluating people not on just how many hours they worked, but on the results they produced? Let's see, I'll pull this up here. Hold on one second. I'm working on 2 different computers right now trying to do this, so I apologize.
I'm just glad I remembered to plug mine in, because yesterday I got kicked out of a Zoom, so that was fun. Any other thoughts or questions? Feel free to share those in the chat as well. I know we're coming to kind of the top of the hour, but there's still some time for that, and then we can stay afterwards as well for a little bit to chat with after we're done recording.
Any other questions in the meantime as I'm trying to pull this up for myself?
Rolling through, I don't think so. Lots of very positive um, regards for what you're sharing, and definitely some kudos for you, which I agree with. Let me see, sometimes I do miss some, so I'm just double checking.
So here, okay, I found some
We're good.
examples for you now. Like when you think about like you're talking about performance criteria, right? And what are some of the ways you can evaluate that differently? So if someone is on the lower end of the spectrum of performance, you might, they might fail to deliver on commitments or fail to meet deadlines, or they struggle in ambiguity. Their decisions are more short-term focused, not long-term focused. Those are things that maybe are, more lower end performance. Whereas somebody who does really well, let's go across like one performance criteria. Maybe that'll help. So for example, someone on the low end of, delivering results, they fail to consider relevant information and make the right trade-offs would be a low end. Middle of the road would be they consider information and often balance trade-offs. High end of the bar is that they evaluate, consider relevant information and balance the right trade-offs effectively. So it's just kind of looking at a skill set or looking at a task and describing what each of those performances of that task would look like, so people can kind of better gauge. Like for example, if somebody gets lost in the details and stays too surface level, that's a low end of the bar. But if they can dive deep and understand nuances and complexities of the work, that's very high end, right? So when you're looking at like how they evaluate data, are they getting lost? Are they doing much more than are they diving deeper into it? That would be high end. If somebody struggles to take ownership of mistakes, that's something that it could be a low end evaluation versus somebody who owns up to it, learns from it, and also makes changes, to that, learning or what they've learned and actually implements changes when necessary. That's, higher performance in that regard around accountability. So that's an example of ways you can kind of, structure out, the key criteria that you want in a skill, and then kind of break it out to what is good, what does great look like, what does okay good look like, and what does like bad look like, right? From that perspective.
Okay. Someone did just ask a question. Oh, there's some activity since. So I love those criteria, Shary. Can you share any of those scales? Do you have any, are you able to share any of those, or is there a resource maybe you can point us towards?
I'll have to find a resource that's a more generalized resource that I can share. But yeah, definitely can point you to some best practices that are out there.
Yep, and then we'll make sure to put that in when we post the link to this replay. We'll make sure to put these resources in there as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious to know, like, how many folks in your workplaces have you feel you have very clear criteria on performance right now? Like, do you have like a hand raise feature?
Yeah, hand raise, reaction.
Stick it in the chat, however.
Yeah, whatever. Lots of different ways. Because I'm curious too.
It's a great question.
No, yeah.
Yeah, so far it says not here. Yeah, it doesn't seem like silence might be that totally unclear. There's another one. So
well, and right. So
the challenge, right? If you don't know what good performance looks like, how are you supposed to meet that bar, and how we expect our employees to meet that bar, right? So clear communication is important, and letting people know what does it take, to achieve, this high level ratings. I think we can't hold that as a secret, right? We want people to achieve them, so they should be transparent, in order for everyone to know exactly what it takes to move forward. I think, again, like we mentioned, ambiguity is a progress, barrier, right? If we don't know what it takes, how are we supposed to ever get there? And ambiguity right now, like we said, is at an all-time high. So
yes, it's interesting. Someone says that their company was amazing at this. It says, I created a measurement tool for our organization, but appreciate some of the skills Shary shared and would like to improve mine. I am like middle of the road on it, some clarity, but seems to change as you change leaders, even though you're in the same role. Yep, I've heard that one. Our evaluations have changed multiple times over the 15 years I've been here, from overly ambiguous to extremely defining. Interesting.
Interesting.
That's very interesting. So that's where that communication piece comes in too, because whenever someone's like, I'm unclear, we should never really be in a situation where people are unclear about what's expected of them. How do you rate someone if they haven't even, back to your point, Shary, if we haven't even told them what we're measuring against?
Or even the flip side, if you're so stringent and so defined, where does that flexibility come in?
Yeah, I think one of the good best practice as well is, we've learned that immediately before evaluating somebody, if you are reminded of the bias pitfalls right before that, and whether you have a conversation or you read a document before you do it, it helps kind of alter your perspective and helps to mitigate bias when you're making those evaluations. So we recommend that if you are, hosting a meeting and talking about performance, that you take the time in the beginning of that meeting to remind everyone, here are some biases that we might, face or we might see. Let's make sure that we check each other on these as we go through the process.
Any other questions? Sorry, I thought I was on mute as I'm doing I do that once in a while where I catch my 90 words per minute typing on there. Sorry for your ears all. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? I know you're all really good about putting those in the chat. I'm going to, we always post the replay out there on LinkedIn, so we'll make sure we do that in a moment. I'm going to put the YouTube channel chat in there, so if you join later, and of course for our lovely team replay, we have some very loyal folks there too, so we don't want to forget them. But definitely we'll be doing that. So feel free to share anything you want to add in, Suman or Shary. Are there any final parting thoughts you want to share with us on this?
No, I think it's just, I think this is a great forum and it's a great opportunity to just have that reminder, right? To think about extenuating circumstances. It may not even be like just during COVID right now. There's extenuating circumstances that happen with employees all the time. And it's just a good reminder to be aware of that and to be aware of the experiences that our employees are having throughout the year, on a regular basis, to really better understand, and accommodate for that and really calibrate. Like always be calibrating is really the lesson of the day, I think, as well.
Add this link. You want to close this out, Suman? Oh, you're on mute. I can close this out.
Chatting away. No, this is great. We've got a lot of great comments, a lot of appreciative comments. Everyone is thanking you for the insights and for the great tips. And, we're coming up to the hour, so we appreciate everyone. Stephanie said the replay will be posted. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If anyone wants to stay just a few minutes unrecorded, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you next week, which will be an unrecorded session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Shary. Bye. Happy weekend.